Welcome everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm one of the co-owners and managing directors with Impetus Digital. So for those of you who don't know what Impetus Digital is our company has built some of the best in class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration tools for pharmaceutical and medical device companies and other healthcare stakeholders. We've allowed people to have things like virtual advisory boards and investigator meetings and medical education programs. And unfortunately, since COVID-19, people have been virtualizing their in-person meetings, their brand plan rollouts, and all sorts of other things. So this has been a very interesting year for us. But besides all of that, Impetus really believes that everything starts with a conversation. These big, hairy, audacious, disruptive things that we all are aspiring to do in healthcare starts with that dialogue. It's really the onus and the impetus, no pun intended, of why we've started these fireside chats, because we want to be speaking with people like the Anand Iyers of the world and other disruptive thinkers who've done something a little different that we can all learn from and sort of aspire. We were just having a bit of a conversation earlier about the world as we see it now that we're wearing masks and all these things are going on. So how do we actually use these change accelerants and move forward? So very excited to do that. So with all of that said, I'm super excited to have Anand Iyer here. He has done some amazing things. He has a PhD degree in electrical and computer engineering, and I know his kids are following suit with that. And to kind of sort of smooth over the corners, he also has a business degree, so an MBA. And he's currently the Chief Strategy Officer of Welldoc. And we're going to dig into what that company has done very profoundly and in a very pioneering way. Their work is here to define and implement. He's going to actually share some of their core strategic vision as well. Anand is actually a respected global digital health visionary. He's done things that nobody else has done. So he's paved the way for a lot of us who might be in startups or in small companies or even pharma companies looking at getting into this space. And he brings a lot of years of experience in the technology, strategy, and the regulatory policy fields. And he's been absolutely instrumental in Welldoc's success and the development of Blue Star. So we're going to get into what exactly Blue Star is today. It's one of the first FDA-cleared mobile prescription therapies for adults who are living with type 2 diabetes. And we're going to dig in a little bit more about how common type 2 diabetes is, and we're going to jump into it. So welcome, Anand. Thank you so much for coming into our fireside chat today.
Yeah, great, Natalie. Great to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. So let's actually just jump right in. Let's start talking about the amazing background that you have, starting in the electrical and computer engineering. How did somebody with that background end up in a healthcare company? How did you find them, or how did you find them? So tell us a little bit about where this all came from.
It's like, oh boy, how much time do we have? You're going to ask me one question, and we're going to spend the whole time talking about background. But no, it's a good place to start. So I actually am a son of the great city of Toronto, so it's always great to speak with other folks who are in Toronto. And as you said, electrical engineering undergrad, graduate school. In the late 80s, I moved down to the States, Pittsburgh, at Carnegie Mellon. And prior to that, like everybody else in Canada at the time, worked at Nortel Networks. I think Nortel was just the gateway, if you would, for everybody who wanted to do advanced things in engineering and computing. But when I left Carnegie Mellon in '93, I joined a very interesting management consulting firm, PRTM, based out of Boston. And they're a strategy consulting firm, but one that had a very strong bent in technology, where we would actually take senior technology leadership roles within organizations and help them, if you would, implement, and then find a suitable replacement or a hire and bring them in. And it was right at the dawn of what we called 2G cellular. If you can remember, for those folks, I'm dating myself, but what a second generation cell signal and a cell phone and a cellular network were. And we started and created Nextel as a company. We helped create Vodafone as a company. We helped create a number of global wireless operators, and said, you know what? This is great that you're able to lay the foundation in the pipe, but why not the services on top of the pipe? So we moved to the things that you would expect: retail, manufacturing, automotive telematics. Even after September the 11th, we moved into Department of Defense and Homeland Security. Where could wireless technologies actually help improve safety and security, if you would, of the nation at large? And it was around that time, Natalie, where in the midst of all my flying and everywhere and eating at the wrong times and never exercising, that I developed type 2 diabetes myself. Mm-hmm. And so I affectionately joke that the two things that define me, one is good, which is wireless in my blood. One is not good, which is too much sugar in my blood. But somehow Welldoc has managed to fuse those two things together. And I asked a question at the time, we've done wireless in every other industry. Why not healthcare? And so we started working with the usual suspects. We started working with the Hillroms, the Siemens, the Philips Medical, GE, and working on basic things. Did you know that the #1 missing item in a hospital in the early 2000s was a bed? And I'm thinking, wait a minute, maybe stethoscope, maybe something smaller that you can lose. No, they won't lose beds, but they misplace them. They're in hallways, you can't find them. And we're like, well, that's an easy one. Just put an RFID radio frequency tag on it and find it, right? And have it some console display and say, oh, here it is. It's at the end of, the aisle here in 6th floor. And we started a journey where we started to realize that there was actually a value-added service you could provide for those who suffer from chronic conditions. And as a diabetic, I took just a personal interest in that. And to end, it was one of those proverbial napkin discussions at a bar in New York after a Qualcomm-sponsored conference with a number of other United Healthcare, Matria, Excel Health, where there was a number of endocrinologists who were commiserating the state of diabetes. And they said, well, we try our best. They come in, we tell them what to do. They leave, they come back in 3 months. And it's like the deer in the headlights, right? Garbage in, garbage out. How is your diabetes for the last 3 months? Well, it's like flossing the day before you see the dentist, right? Not as good as you'd want it to be. And we said, what if we could actually do something with wireless? And that is really what the catalyst was. But it's that interesting journey of having the disease myself, but having, as you said, kind of the business acumen and certainly the engineering acumen to say, you know what, we can actually help bend outcomes curves and cost curves in ways that traditional medicine and care can't do alone, right? So background.
So that's fantastic. And I love the fact that you have the empathy because you have the patient perspective, which I think brings a brilliance to something as novel as a digital prescriptive. So let's actually dig a little bit more in giving us the background on Welldoc, specifically this Blue Star program. So give us a little bit of a picture about what makes this unique from, say, for example, somebody who is just giving themselves insulin. Like what is so different about this?
So we'll start at me again, just because it's a real example, right? As a patient with diabetes, you have to manage many, what I would call vectors on a day-to-day basis. One vector is you have to manage your glucose, your blood pressure, your weight, things that you can actually measure, right? That you obtain from medical devices. But you also have to manage what you eat. You have to manage how much you exercise. You have to manage how well you sleep. You have to manage your mental state of mind, positivity, behavioral modification, all those things that follow, social determinants, etc. And there's this wee little thing called life that tends to get in the way, right? And so as a patient, your challenge statement is very simple. How can I do the little things I need to do on a day-to-day basis in each one of these vectors such that I stay in the safe region and I don't progress to a worse state, right? At the same time, I am supposed to see my primary care doctor, or GPs up in Canada. I'm supposed to see my GP 4 times a year. And it's a 5-minute office visit, as you know. It's not like I get to spend all this time. And they're supposed to look at my scribbles, oftentimes on a napkin, oftentimes written while they're waiting in the waiting room, what they ate for the last 3 months. I don't remember what happened yesterday, let alone 3 months ago, but garbage in, garbage out. They're supposed to take that data and they're supposed to optimize the therapy pathway for me. So in one hand, you have a patient who needs to do certain things during the day and every day. And the other hand, you have a provider who's supposed to take sense of all of that data and say, oh, okay, I need to put you on this pathway or this pathway, right? And in many ways, it's the fusion of those two pieces that has really created the bedrock, the foundation of what Welldoc and Blue Star is. And so our mission as a company is, how do you actually support both patients and their healthcare provider teams to actually take control of their chronic conditions, diabetes, hypertension, weight, and soon to be many other conditions that we'll talk through. But how do you empower them to do that using clinically evidence-based, well-designed, trusted products that have met the requirements of the regulatory agencies, FDA, Health Canada, et cetera, that have demonstrated outcomes with the same rigor that you would use if you were bringing a new drug or medical device to market. So in English, it works, and the clinical system trusts it. So how do you actually do that in a way that takes into account user behavior science, user experience science, clinical best practices science, and how do you deliver it through this mobile platform, that real-time and longitudinal coaching? So think of our mission to really help bring patients and providers together on this mobile digital health platform to then help them make the daily decisions they need to make in each of these dimensions, right? So there's a duality, patient and provider. You're actually bringing them together and letting them stand on technology's shoulders. They can reach further now. They can do better. And we should go down this path further and explain kind of what that might mean in more detail.
Well, I'm absolutely very interested in this. And so really what we're seeing with this digital prescriptive is you're utilizing these 1% efforts, these small habits that we do on a day-to-day basis as being, in some ways, the medicine. I'm kind of referring to the book by James Clear called Atomic Habits, which is these small, incremental, consistent movements, motions, things that we do that really is the medicine. So can you speak to how Blue Star, the algorithm, this particular tool works in that regard?
Yeah, so I say this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I'm dead serious. The blockbuster drug of this century is the engaged patient. If we get them to do the things that their healthcare provider and their healthcare providers want them to do, more than likely they're going to stay in the right place, right? And so the mechanism of action, the equivalent of the biologic or the pill or the formulaic representation of a compound, is the patient actually self-engaging. So in our Blue Star platform, I enter a blood glucose, for example, and that could come with me manually entering it. It could come from a connected blood glucose Bluetooth meter. It could even come from a continuous glucose monitor, CGM, right? And based on a series of algorithms and rules that are driven by evidence-based guidelines, Blue Star tells me what to do specifically. So as an example, let's say that I have a high blood sugar after lunch, and let's say that you, Natalie, have the same high blood sugar after lunch, but you're on metformin and Januvia, and I'm on Lantus and Byetta. How we bring that high blood sugar down into range is actually going to be clinically different. Your pathway and my pathway may involve different things to do. I may have to take some more medicine. You may actually have to, exercise a little bit because you're not on short-acting insulin. And so the ability to provide at that point of care, precision, real-time feedback on what to do, whether it's a glucose reading, a blood pressure reading, a medication reading, an activity reading, a sleep reading, a food reading, etc. Imagine the real-time feedback that one gets, and over time, hey, Natalie, this is how you did this week on your glucose, or this is what your med adherence was this week, and here's the teachable moment, but not just in a single vector, across vectors. Your glucose was high this week because of this violating meal, or because you skipped your medications here. So you have real-time feedback and longitudinal feedback. The combination of the two is what actually creates this movement from data to information, information to knowledge, knowledge to action, action to outcomes. And it's that continuum. Yes, you need data to start, but you have to finish that continuum in order to actually deliver value. So think of what we do is providing that precision feedback that's based on their med regimen, that's based on their comorbid conditions, that's based on their medical history, and that's based on their doctor's instructions for them of how to optimize their pathway to get to a better place.
So this is a great example of what we are all aiming for, which is the N=1 therapy, or ultra or uber precision medicine. And so with all of that said, I just kind of want to back up a little bit about the original entry into you doing clinical studies. Tell us a little bit about why the company chose diabetes specifically. And can you share, because there's a lot of different people, either pharma, large organizations, or either small companies interested in this space. What was that pathway, the regulatory pathway? Why did you choose that disease state? And tell us some of the pioneering efforts that you had to do to get through this so this could actually be considered a prescription.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we start at the macro level, Natalie, I'll use US statistics, but I'll then also expand globally to give our audience a global flavor. So in the United States today, the CDC says 12.7% of adults have type 2 diabetes. Okay? Of our total population of diabetic folks know the difference between type 1, which is often called juvenile diabetes, but it's where your pancreatic function is basically, you don't produce any insulin, you have to augment with insulin shots. And of course, type 2 diabetes, there's multiple forms of type 2 diabetes, but it's the larger portion of the market. It's about 90% of the total diabetes market. Type 1 is about 10%. But in the United States, with that incidence of 12.7%, we spend on average $345 billion a year. Now, just to put that into perspective, the GDP of the United States is somewhere around 19 trillion, right? And about 1/6 of that, so let's say 3 trillion between friends, $3 trillion is spent on healthcare, of which 10% is on this one insidious disease. And that's like, wait a minute, how many diseases can you count? There's lots. 10% of the entire healthcare spend in the United States is on one disease. And people don't die of high blood sugar. They die because of the complications of high blood sugar. They die of the heart attacks, kidney failure, blindness, amputation, stroke. And so it's absolutely paramount to actually make these tiny habits, as you said, these small changes, such that you avoid the downstream costs, you avoid the downstream complications. All of that to say, that's why we started with diabetes. A, it's a very measurable disease. I can poke myself, or I can put a sensor on my body and I can get data. I can't do that for cancer, for example. There is no a sensor I can put on my body to give me a cancer count. If there were, perhaps we'd find innovative ways of managing cancer the way we manage diabetes. It's a measurable disease. It's one that requires intervention on those 6 dimensions we talked about, and it happens to be a big burden. So just to give you a flavor, we're lucky here in the US, right? It's 12.7%. In India, it's 15. In China, it's 17. If you go to the GCC, just the Gulf Cooperation Council, so Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, etc., it's 34%. More than 1 out of every 3 people have diabetes there. And it's a huge global problem. And so we said, let's start with this disease in mind, because it does touch so many people around the globe and it affects so much of our healthcare spend. And said, if we actually wanted to create something that the healthcare system would trust, well, what do we need to do? And therein lies Dr. Collins' famous quote from the National Institutes of Health here in Bethesda, Maryland, which is the absence of evidence the evidence of absence? In English, if you want to be a player, you better have the evidence. Well, how do you create evidence in drug world? You do a randomized control study. You have a placebo group, right? You have an intervention group, and you power it for some statistical difference. In our case, hemoglobin A1C. Can I bend the hemoglobin A1C curve where my intervention is the use of an app or digital therapeutic, right? And can I control for all the other variables? And what we found, on average, a 2-point reduction in hemoglobin A1C, which, by the way, the FDA requires a new drug to be cleared to clear a 0.5 delta in A1C. There's 4x of what's required. And people would literally say, are they swallowing the phone? We're like, no. They're doing what their doctors told them to do, right? And doctors who received that report, the analysis that comes back that effectively illuminates the pathway forward, were 2 to 4 times more likely to make a medication change or titrate a medication. So we saw in one swift move that if you engage the patient on a day-to-day basis, and you engage their healthcare providers in a nice periodic fashion, you could bend the numerator curve. And then we said, well, in order for this to be embraced, okay, checkmark number 1 is outcomes. Checkmark number 2, it has to be proven to be safe to use. In English, it has to be cleared by the FDA or Health Canada, and we have clearances in both countries. And that means that it has to go through the hands of the regulator and their scrutiny to ensure that it's safe, you're you're mitigating risks in a meaningful way, and that you've built your product using good manufacturing process. So it's repeatable, it's scalable, et cetera, right? It's measurable. And so the second journey for us was, yes, you had to get FDA clearance, because now you have an outcome and you have the validation from the regulatory authorities that it's safe for patients to use. And then only can it be prescribed, if you would, by a physician, because that's the pathway for a drug, that's the pathway for a medical device. And so we took the same pathway initially. Today, we've expanded beyond that because we have both RX and OTC clearances for our product. But the short answer to your question, if you were to repeat that and summarize everything I just said, the only way to go down that pathway is with the same rigor that you would apply if you were bringing a new drug or a medical device to market.
Yeah, very interesting. So with those initial studies that you did, let's just say for all intents and purposes, through the FDA, were those the sort of same standard phase 2, phase 3 methodology? What were you comparing yourself in the phase 3? Was best supportive care? Tell us a little bit about the clinical trial dynamics, because again, we're talking about a lot of rigor here, and people who are in the know, many people who might also be manufacturing chemical drugs for this. So what were those studies based on?
So very simple answer to that, Natalie, which is in any clinical trial, you want to have a control group, right? So in this case, it's standard of care. So we recruited all of our patients from the community, because the lion's share of diabetes patients are actually seen by primary care or GPs, right? There's not enough endocrinologists in either Canada or the US to see around. They usually are there to focus on the more brittle type 1 patients, right? So we recruited patients and physicians from the community, and in the control group, you had standard of care. You know, meters, strips, see your doctor every 3 months, you know, regular way of managing diabetes, do whatever you do. And in the intervention group, you had patients who got our Blue Star product, and you had physicians who got the Smart Visit report from the Blue Star product. And we actually, very important lesson learned here, when we designed our second clinical trial, the large one that was published in the Journal of the American Diabetes Association, we actually took the intervention group and split it into 3, because we wanted to answer the business question: where's the value coming from? Okay, I got it. You lowered A1C by 2 points. What was causing it? Was it because the patient was doing what they were supposed to be doing? Was it because the doctor was titrating the medications or adding? Where did the effect come from? So in our first intervention arm, the patient got Blue Star, the doctor got nothing. Right? If the patient wanted to print their data off, they could have taken it into the office. In the second intervention arm, the patient got Blue Star and the doctor just got the raw glucose logbook, like they would get on the written piece of paper or napkin, right? And then, of course, in the last intervention arm, the patient got Blue Star and the doctor got that formatted, analyzed report that told them against clinical-based guidelines what they should do with the patient every 3 months. And no surprises, it was the last group that had the biggest outcome. And so in many ways, the clinical trial design is followed exactly what you would do if you're doing a clinical trial on a new drug or a new biologic or a new vaccine, apropos today, which everybody's doing around the globe for COVID-19. And so it's the same.
So were the patients who were using Blue Star, were they also did they stop doing their glucometers and strict? So was it all or nothing, or was it on top of that?
On top of, because you still, Blue Star requires a glucose input, right? And today there's no cell phone that'll tell you that. You have to use a glucometer, or you have to use a continuous glucose monitor, Bluetooth or not, or you have to just type in the digits once you poke your finger and draw your blood. So standard of care in one hand, control group, blood glucose meter, you know, see your doctor every quarter. The only difference in the left hand was you're adding Blue Star software, coaching them what to do with all of those, and coaching them on their food, their activity, their sleep, etc.
Beautiful, love it. What a really interesting space. So I want to linger on this. So you've gone through, you were one of the pioneers of bringing software as a medical device. I mean, is that what it would be considered, software as a medical device? There's like entire new policies written in healthcare agencies across the globe, including the FDA. What was it like building this? I mean, were you building this with the FDA?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. So the short answer is yes. When we actually received our first 510K clearance as a class 2 medical device nearly a decade ago, we have 8 of them today. and we're actually filing for our 9th. So it's been an amazing journey. We actually, at the time, there was no mobile medical guidance document. There was people inside the FDA who were like, what are you trying to clear a cell phone? Or what's an app? I mean, you can imagine, it's early days of iPhone world, right? And so we absolutely worked hand in hand with them to say, look, we believe we have something that is going to bend the curve in ways that drugs alone can't bend. We believe that it will fall underneath the purview because you're now helping the patient to manage their insulin, titrate their insulin. You're giving them real-time coaching on a clinical value. So you're crossing that line into this clinical coaching space that raises the risk profile. And so we think we should be a regulated device and meet all the criteria associated with a regulated device. And so it was a fantastic dialogue, as it was with Health Canada, when we got our first Health Canada clearance and MDL license to operate there, that says there's a learning for both of us, okay? Now, 2014, 2015, the FDA actually invited Welldoc. We were the only company invited to attend what's known as the IMDRF, which is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. So it's the regulators from around the world. So, Health Canada, FDA, NHS England, PMDA in Japan, TGA in Australia, the Swedes, the Brazilians, etc. And there were 4 meetings that were conducted. The first was in Brazil. The second one was in Sweden. The third one was in Washington, D.C., and the fourth one was in Ottawa. And we actually helped write the guidance document for what you exactly described, SAMD, software as a medical device, underneath the IMDRF guidelines. So it is a very well globally understood construct that, I mean, think about it. So I'll pose this out for our audience, which is, when we started with e-banking, remember in the old days, e-banking? And people are like, oh, e-banking, what a cool, who calls it e-banking anymore? Nobody calls it e-banking, right? If you don't have an E as part of your banking, you're not a bank anymore, right? You're not part of the party. You're a dinosaur. I don't think we're going to call it digital therapeutics or digital health. We're just going to call it health. And if you don't have a digital component going forward, so think about this, Natalie. The iPhone was first came out in 2007, right? And so we're in 2020 now, so we're 13 years later. The first generation of iPhone babies are going to be going to college in 4 years. And they're going to be going to medical school 4 years later. So we are 6 to 8 years away from the first iPhone generation kids going into medical school. Do you think for a moment that they're not going to want digital to be part of health? Digital is every part of their life that they grew up with. Of course it's going to be part of my health. So I think there's a, dare I say, inevitability of this. And our job, as we're almost like, I think, collectively in the digital health industry, Welldoc helped co-found the Digital Therapeutics Alliance with other thought leaders in the digital therapeutic space. Our job is to be Sherpas and to guide this forward in a clinically validated, clinically responsible. We did a wonderful project with the Ontario Telemedicine Network and Ed Brown, who's the CEO of OTN up in 2 in Toronto, 1 up in Thunder Bay. Our job is to guide how this can actually help unlock clinical value and economic value across the globe.
Which actually brings me to my next question. So I think it's fascinating being a pioneer in this space that's new, that's novel. It really is says something. And I'm curious if now that you've laid the foundation, if it's now become easier more than ever for other pharmaceutical, medical device, startups, small businesses, entrepreneurs to now forge ahead, although what may appear in the future is potentially a crowded digital therapeutic space, just like there is the chemical entity space. So that's going to be an interesting question for the future. But also, just as you have navigated and pioneered the development of these kinds of guidelines and protocols and review processes, the regulatory agencies, what have you done as a company at the reimbursement level, access? So now that we're talking beyond the consumer, B2C, over the counter, we're now involving Medicaid, Medicare, in Canada, various agencies and market access providers. is what was that dialogue, and how do you get a physician to think about a patient actually paying, or an entity actually paying for an app on a phone?
So in pharmacologic parlance, they call this the bench to bedside abyss, right? How do you start with the clinical bench and how do you get it to the patient bedside where they're actually consuming the drug, right? Oh, step one was invent the molecule. In our case, invent the algorithm, right? Step two is put it through a randomized control study, identical for digital, put it through a randomized control study. Step three is get it cleared by the FDA. Same step for us, get it cleared by the FDA. Step four is, what's the business model? Now, what was interesting in our case, because it was so new, because we were the first digital therapeutic in diabetes to be cleared by the FDA here in the United States, the FDA looked at us and said, okay, so what happens if I log into your account by accident and take your amount of insulin and harm myself? And we're like, okay, that's not going to happen. But okay, we kind of understand your psyche as a risk-based organization. And they said, okay, we're going to give you a 510K clearance. You got everything else, check, 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 but we're going to make it an RX only. That means it has to physically start with the doctor prescribing your app, hence the term mobile prescription therapy that you referred to. And we're like, wow, great, innovative, super. Software is a drug, right? Amazing. But it wasn't the smartest software model because software is inherently supposed to be scalable. It should reach millions, right? Now it's a 1RX, 1RX, 1RX at a time. And we collected the data. We actually went and knocked on doctors' doors, believe it or not, in our early days and put samples, not pill bottle samples or packet samples, but code samples. Said, if you have a diabetes patient whose A1C is out of control, take the sample and give it to him, get him on the product, right? Just like you would a sample drug. And we went back to the FDA in 2017, 2018 and said, look, Natalie's doing great, Anand's doing great. Do we really need the RX? And they said, show us your data. And we did, and we got the OTC clearance. What that allowed you to do is now go to a payer, three types. You could go to an insurer, public or private. You could go to a self-insured employer, or you could go to a clinic, like an IDN hospital system, right? Think of University Health Network in Toronto, for example. Right? And I can have a software licensing model where they can now dispense it to their members, patients, employees, et cetera, right? And if you want the payment pathway to come back through the pharmaceutical, benefit management adjudicated pathway, then you have to get a code. In our early days, we actually got an NHRIC code so that we were actually listed. It's funny, we're actually listed on the drug databases, but we were an app, right? Today, what you see with CMS here in the United States, Medicare, Medicaid, you see a lot of these, what they call remote monitoring codes. And these remote monitoring codes have actually been around for quite a while. But because of COVID-19, they've kind of, elevated their status and people are using them more because you can't just go to your doctor's office, but your doctor can interact with you with these clinically validated digital tools, to avoid fraud, abuse, waste. You have to meet some certain criteria, right? And so they can be reimbursed underneath those codes, or as we and others in this space are doing, we're approaching Congress to say, fine, there's existing codes that you can kind of squeeze your product into. It's a little bit of square peg in a round hole kind of thing. Why don't we just define a new square hole? Why don't we define a new class of codes for digital therapeutics that meet all the requirements of clinical validity, FDA clearance, cybersecurity, interoperability, blah, 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 and get them coded and reimbursed? And so I think the business model itself is evolving. I think it's evolving at a more rapid rate, and the heterogeneity of what's coming through that pipeline. Real example, just 4 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago, one of my dear friends, Eddie Martucci, is the CEO of a company called Achille Interactive based out of Boston, got the first FDA clearance for a video game that treats ADHD. And they improve cognition by some, 20 to 30% in their 3-year randomized control study. Who would have thought, Natalie, forget 2 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that the FDA would clear a video game as a therapeutic pathway for a... So all of this to say we're moving, the whole industry is moving, and we're seeing examples in substance abuse, we're seeing examples in neurological, in diabetes, in heart, in musculoskeletal. We're seeing a great platform for innovation for companies. to do these things in a clinically responsible and scientifically responsible way, where they're adding amazing value in outcomes and costs.
How has Welldoc tried to solve the insurmountable interoperability equation? We want to create ultimately in everybody, this is pharmaceutical, medical device, digital therapeutic companies, want to create a frictionless environment. When we talk about those 1% incremental habit changes, those exist with prescribers as well. You get used to what you're used to. You do what the same old norm is because that's what you're used to. How does this get embedded in the psyche, into the day-to-day tools, in their phones, in their electronic health records, and maintaining and managing? What was that process like of trying to navigate and build that?
So it's a remarkable question, because it actually touches on what we call our, it's our third, what we call vector of differentiation, kind of why us, right? Our first vector of differentiation, by the way, is AI-driven personalization. So you're actually using data-driven inputs to actually customize exactly and precisely what President Obama called precision medicine. You're taking that same precision medicine concept, but you're applying it to your scientific algorithm that then tells the patient to do X, Y, or Z based on a series of parameters. The second vector, which we touched upon quite a bit, was outcomes, right? Clinically validated outcomes, RCTs, et cetera. But the third one is device, data, and system interoperability. Why? Now, all of a sudden, I'm taking my iPhone and my Blue Star app, but I'm connecting my Fitbit and my Apple Watch, or my sleep monitor, or my weight scale, or my blood pressure cuff, or my Blue Coat. So I'm connecting things on the consumer side, but I'm also wanting to connect into my pharmacy. I want to connect into my CVS, Walgreens, Walmart, you know, in the future, Shoppers Drug Mart, McKesson, et cetera. But I also want to connect into the labs, Quest, LabCorp. I want to connect into the EMRs, Epic, Cerner, McKesson, et cetera. And so you actually want to design your software. You know how you used to have like design for testability, you have design for, you know, usability. Well, here you want design for integrability. And integrability is on the right side with the consumer devices, and on the left side, and use the right word, Natalie, it's frictionless. Why? Why should I bother the patient to say, well, tell me how you exercise today? If I can just get that data and I can see a continuous glucose monitor trace, I can tell you exactly the correlation between your exercise and your glucose, and tell you at the end of the day, hey, here's the 3 things that really work today. Try that again tomorrow, or, you know, whatever the messaging construct is. And associated with that level of interoperability is 2 things. 1, we're really good at patient behavior modification and algorithms. There are many other people who are much better at data integration than we are. So the mantra here is partner. So Xealth, Human API, Redox, we have 3 amazing partners that they basically connect us to whoever we want to be connected to. And the last one, which cannot be overemphasized, is the necessity for cybersecurity. So just think about it. How many, if I'm connecting this many things, how many points of vulnerability have I just created? And so SOC 2 certification, high trust certification, these are absolute necessities for a digital therapeutic, because then you solve the interoperability to create the frictionless environment you just said, but you do it again in a, not in this case, not just clinically scientific responsible, but also cyber responsible, which is huge, right?
Absolutely. I think this field is very intriguing. And one of the things that comes to my mind as I do a comparison of these new novel digital therapeutics versus the traditional, chemical entities, they have patents, just like digital does. And then there's a loss of exclusivity, and then the whole process with that. What does that look like in the digital space as we start to get really crowded? How do these products differentiate? And I think another caveat to that question is about algorithms, neural networks, machine learning. The fact that your tool is going to be smarter over time, which could translate to the FDA perspective, that what a patient's product in 2 years' time is not the same chemical entity that you gave or administered them at day 1. So what does that look like around patents, around exclusivity, and then the change and modification of this product over time?
Wow. So lots of stuff there. Let's try to address each one, which is molecule is to, or patent is to molecule what patent is to algorithm. So the two parallel worlds of drugs and digital therapeutics. So we actually have 11 granted US patents today, and I think we have some 6 or 7, I don't know the exact number, that are in the queue soon to be granted. And what are we actually patenting? You're patenting exactly that AI-driven algorithm that actually takes into account this multivariate input and precisely tells a person what to do against a series of clinical guidelines and rules. So 11 patents, the same way Merck or a Pfizer or a GSK would patent its molecule, we patent our algorithms, okay? Second is, there's actually a very interesting organization. I don't know the equivalent in Canada, Natalie, but here it's called USP, which is the United States Pharmacopoeia, now celebrating nearly their 200th anniversary. Amazing. And in the early days, they would write instructions on, this is the exact formula for acetaminophen. This is the exact mix of compounds, and this is how you know that ingredient A is true, ingredient B is true and pure, etc. And they asked a very simple question to the digital therapeutics community. It was at a conference that McKinsey, our friends at McKinsey hosted here in Washington, DC, which is, how do you actually tell if your software binary code that you stick up in the iTunes store where somebody downloads Bluestar is in fact Bluestar? How can you tell if it's the authentic code? In the drug world, you think of the word, they use counterfeits, right? How can you tell it's not counterfeit? And so now the community is thinking about, oh yeah, that's actually, well, my binary code has an exact 1-0 pattern. I could actually tell right away whether it's a counterfeit or not, right? And so they're actually guiding us to say we should take the drug analogy and we should make sure that our programs are not just intellectual property protected, but we should also ensure that we have an identity for each one of these that's not copyable, so that you don't have this concept of a counterfeit, okay? Lastly, so this is a fun one for me because I did all my doctoral work in pattern recognition, so I'll put it out there. I'm a little bit of a data junkie, okay? So I get excited about this kind of stuff. But if I have data, and now I have high frequency data, think about what data a doctor had on their diabetes patient. They see them once a quarter and they ask them a couple of questions, and they may see a blood glucose meter with a couple of readings. That's it. And they're supposed to decide what to do and how to optimize that patient's outcome with that very limited data, and that too very infrequent, every 3 months. Now you have this very dense, so we use, you've probably seen it, we use these 5 Vs. The velocity of data has increased. The veracity has increased because you're getting data directly from sensors, right? The volume has increased and the variety has increased. And it's the combination of those 4 V's that create the 5th V, which is value. The way you drive value. And how? I can do informative data analytics. Hey, I now know how weekends versus weekdays work. I know the difference when I exercise and I don't. So I can make these kind of binary comparisons on all attributes of my diabetes. It's pretty obvious to me because I can see the data. There's discovery analysis. Why? So informative asks the question, tell me what happened. Discovery says, tell me why it happened. Why is it that Fridays this is happening? Or why is it that people on this drug regimen and this medication are having this effect in Bluestar? So I can discover patterns and trends that I wouldn't otherwise know. And then I can extrapolate or predict and say, hey, this is what's going to happen. And then lastly, I can adapt, which brings you to the last point you mentioned. The molecule is the molecule is the molecule. Januvia is the same molecule it was when it came out 17 years ago. But my algorithm can adapt. And if my algorithm adapts, and if I have real world evidence, the FDA is really promoting this concept of real world evidence and FDA pre-cert, the program where if I can show you in a trusted, demonstrable way that I've evolved my algorithm and I've done it in a way that creates incremental benefit and holds the risk constant or even decreases the risk, can I make a new claim? So the concept of adaptive claims, because think about it, right? The software development cycle, I could come up with a new claim every 3 months if I have a 3-month sprint. And so digital therapeutics actually opens up and unlocks this opportunity for rapid innovation and adaption of these claims that you can't do with traditional meds. You just can't. And so it's actually a really important area of growth. People always ask, hey, where are you headed? Yes, other diseases. Yes, other geographies, all the obvious things, connect to more devices. Sure. Data will be the healthcare currency of tomorrow. And what you do with that data to personalize and ensure in a fun, safe, rigorous way to support patients and providers, that's where the puck is headed. I had to put a hockey analogy in there, being a kid.
I loved it.
That's where the puck is headed, right? And so that's an important one.
I love it. And I often refer to it as data as a service. So DAS of the future. It's the new oil, the new gas. It's really, so I want to get to a few other crunchy things. There's so many things to talk to you about it on. So you bring up a really important point around population management, health management, some of the key drivers and dynamics. I mean, we're just coming out of COVID-19, all the controversy associated with these contact tracing devices and privacy. I'm thinking blockchain. I'm thinking about these really safe, secure ways. You talked about putting identifiers or keys on it. The idea is, how does this apply to counterfeit code as it would with drugs? What's the supply chain? Is this coming and originating from Welldoc? It also begs the question around data security, cybersecurity, as it relates to the whole controversy on bioethics. But I think a third component that we oftentimes don't talk about is potentially the monetization of health data. As we think about the world of potential universal basic income and people sitting home with sensors detecting their health while they're watching TV through facial recognition software, et cetera, and other sensors and through Welldoc. When people dig into that data lake or eventually data oceans, and they tap in to mine that to like an oil refinery to use the data for clinical studies, for discovery, for population health management, curation. Where does blockchain fit into your long-term plans and in your algorithms?
Yeah, so it fits into all of the things that you said at various points. So let's dissect this one again. The security of a digital therapeutic system can, if I were to grossly oversimplify it, to three things. One is authentication, proper authentication. One is encryption, right? And one is non-repudiation. So authentication says, am I getting access to what I should be getting access to? It's a permission thing, right? And authentication, of course, only has three forms. It's must have, must know, and must be. So play that again. Must have, must know, must be. Must have, think about, Natalie, you and I work in the same office building. Oh, I forgot my bag in the conference room. Can I just borrow your card to get back in? How many times do we do that every day? We do it, right? So all I need is your card and I'm authenticated to my building. One level of security, but certainly not enough. Must know is beyond having the card, I need to know something, like a password, right? 4 or 6 digit. NIST says it should be 6 digits here, right? For combinatorial security. And then lastly is must be. It's got to be you. And if it's a thumbprint or a retinal scan, right? So blockchain can actually help implement those 3 elements, and it comes for free with blockchain. It's actually amazing technology. So it's an opportunity to use blockchain. The second part is encryption, right? So today's encryption, NIST has AES, Advanced Encryption Standard, 256-bit is what you should be using in your digital health apps. If you're not, start using it, because that's what the standard is going to be globally. GDPR is requiring 256-bit AES as well. It's the same standard everywhere. And blockchain, again, I can now use blockchain if I want to go nuts. I can encrypt cyber encrypt every single key and every single data element. Now, is it necessary to put blockchain around the number of steps I took? Maybe not. It's overkill, right? If somebody wants to know that, that's fine. Today, the meds I'm on are PII, right? But not the number of steps I took. And so we have to ask a question of economic balance here. You know, at what point do you over engineer the solution where you're getting no return on investment on that over engineering? And then the last, of course, is non-repudiation, that says, what do I do and how do I acknowledge that in fact this is the correct non-counterfeit, correct data that was transferred, correct application usage. So blockchain actually rears its head in all three of those elements, right? And I think that going forward, as you look at data as a service, is what you said earlier on, there's absolutely an opportunity, should one want to create a model that's data as a service, where, you know what, I'm going to give you all the devices for free. It's kind of Google's model, right? You get to use all their products for free, and they monetize the data through advertising predominantly, but in other ways as well. I think the challenge to that in healthcare is almost a societal and generational challenge, which is the millennial population today, who will become the expensive chronic disease patients of tomorrow, they'll share anything. They'll share whatever they want. I mean, look what they do on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, whatever it is. They'll share anything. And so their mentality is, if I can share my data and it's going to help somebody else cure cancer, hey, knock yourself out. Take my data. I could care less. That's not the same as your Gen X. It's a little more, well, that's my data. So if you're an optimist, you're like, well, geez, I just got another one generation to go before everybody does it. They're not going to do it because I'm going to be, millennials are going to be the old guys, right? If you're a pessimist, you're like, well, how do I actually solve the next 15 years and ensure that I can create responsible, and that's the key word. I don't want to be bombarded with advertisements because somebody knows what my diabetes habits are and whatnot. If I choose to get bombarded, that's a different thing. So I think data-driven models should be taken very carefully in conjunction with consumer preferences and choices. You shouldn't just assume, and you shouldn't collect without permission. So here, enter stage left, privacy, and then what's really enforceable. Do you remember when GDPR first came out, and in France, the front page of La Presse was, hey, if you take a picture in front of the Eiffel Tower and it's me, a selfie, but Natalie's in the background, I may need to get Natalie's permission to use and put that up on, you know, whatever social media thing I use, which I don't, by the way. I have a wonderful team at Welldoc that does all my social media for me, because me and social media just don't mix, is the honest truth. But were I to do that, right? So just imagine, that's the clash we're up against. And so it's less of a technology issue. It's more of a policy, society issue. But I think the next 10 to 15 years, next generation is really going to be the battleground where we're going to see these things sort themselves out.
Yeah, love the answer. And I'm going to have to put another crunchy question because I have a million of them and I wish I had more time. But in the last 5 minutes, I do want to ask you this again, because we do work with a lot of pharmaceutical companies who are going to be listening to this. What's interesting about what Welldoc is, and just generally what it represents, it's a digital therapeutic. It's disruptive. I'm thinking about the number of industries that you are disrupting. I'm thinking, for example, the pharmacist, right? I'm thinking the nurse, because again, you've created AI-built, social counseling. I'm thinking in some ways, eventually, maybe even the physician, because you're going to be having some of these digital pharmacies that you can maybe get on Play Store or iTunes or, direct to patient marketing. And I'm going to go and get this product and I'm going to get my insurance to pay for it. And lastly, what about the pharmaceutical companies, who are having potentially products that may or may, I know right now it's on top of, but tell us a little bit about disruption versus potential partnerships. What does this world look like? And have you had these conversations with companies about extending their patents as an example, or some sort of other types of partnerships and the industries in general that I just spoke of?
So the short answer is absolutely. In fact, disruption, I think, is the pathway to a partnership. In many ways, it creates the bedrock and foundation that you need to actually have a successful partnership, as we have, for example, with LifeScan, as we have with Astellas, based out of Japan, and others in the works. And I think that this concept of disruption, if you were to ask an overworked, underpaid nurse who sees diabetes patients, and who's supposed to go through a list of patients every day. And by the time it's 5 o'clock, they've only gotten through a third of their list and they've missed all the reds at the bottom. They've gone through all the greens, but they've missed all the reds at the bottom. Would you rather the system tell you, hey, you know what, today, just call these 3 people and then do whatever you want. You want to call whoever you want at random, do it. But make sure you call these 3 people and talk to them about A, B, and C specifically. What you've just done is you've made their flow, operational efficiency much higher. And so people ask us, are you trying to remove the provider? We're like, no, it's exactly the opposite. We want to take their scarce capacity and extend it. We want the system to help, instead of you managing 10 patients, you can manage 100 or 200, and you can manage it with the same level of care, diligence, scrutiny. In fact, you could even manage it better. Why? Humans aren't very good at doing the same thing over and over and over again without variation. Machines are, right? Machines algorithmically, if you have the same set of inputs, will always do the same output. We've noticed this in our own clinical trials where one of the unintended consequences, people will come and tell us, yeah, I think I might switch my doctor. We're like, because there's a natural tendency for people to do things who are more informed than people who will do less because they're less informed. And there's no blame here. These are hard things to keep up with for the front lines. They have to deal with COVID, right? Forget about your diabetes. I got to worry about, whether you need to be tested or not, or what this fever is due to, right? So they're overwhelmed, and technology can actually help them. So I think in this realm, I think what we're going to see going forward is disruption, where disruption enables them to achieve higher levels of operational efficiency, reach, scale. That's positive. And yeah, it doesn't matter who you are in the ecosystem, pharmaceutical company, a pharmacy, a hospital system, a doctor, it doesn't matter, an insurer. Every single person is going to embrace this because it's going to deliver ROI. It will unequivocally deliver ROI, and it's going to get patients to a safer place where at the macroeconomic level, we're going to be better off as a society.
And I'm sure, without exception, that during this unfortunate issue with the COVID pandemic, I'm sure that Welldoc has seen a huge influx or bolus of patients coming through. Not only does it have, deliver things through sensors and everyday usage of materials and objects and things that people use that can actually transmit this data electronically via the whole telemedicine world. So I think that you guys were ahead of the game. So unfortunately for us, we've run out of time. I could literally talk to you for hours. This is a fascinating topic. In addition to you, I'm a huge data geek, and I find this incredible. So I'm so intrigued. Can't wait to watch all the new pioneering things that Welldoc is going to be doing. For those of you who, again, didn't hear at the beginning, we will have a YouTube and podcast. We'll be sending links to all of those for who want to send this out to share. Again, this is actually the story behind Impetus, why we have these fireside chats, disruptive innovators, people who are doing the big, hairy, audacious thing. And this is how we're all going to positively change and modify the healthcare system that we're living in fact, the world that we live in. And it starts here with the conversation. If you're somebody who's interested in having some of these conversations, think about the Impetus Insight platform, where we can help you have some of these asynchronous and synchronous virtual discussions with your stakeholders. So thank you again, Anand, for your fantastic discussion today.
Thank you,
and
Natalie. What a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for attending today. Wishing you a wonderful day ahead.